welcome to the Dr. America Show. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram, and for today's episode, we're going to be focusing on gun violence. This episode is broadcasting on the 2-year anniversary of the tragic shooting that happened at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut, back in December of 2012. And in recognition of that 2-year anniversary, we want this episode to focus on gun violence as a public health issue and a crisis, and explore all the different things that we can do as Americans, as voters, as family members to help our families be safe when it comes to guns. Before we get into the statistics and the policy updates and all that, I want to take a moment to clarify, why guns are a public health issue and why doctors and why public health experts have every reason to talk about the dangers they pose. Our discussions about guns are part of our duty. They are part of the oath that many of us as health professionals have taken to protect our patients from harm. And as a pediatrician, I talk about all kinds of things, safety issues, with my families, how to store cleaning supplies, how to store medicine so kids don't get poisoned by any of that stuff, how to install how to install a car seat, when to, help a child transition from a booster seat to a seat belt, and, just like a variety of safety issues that, include things like swimming pools. I've had to talk to families about, being safe around fireworks for the 4th of July. And, I talk about all these issues because it's my duty to share public health information that will keep families safe. And, when I talk about these issues or when I have written about them in the past, I've never been criticized for being un-American. There are no insults made to my patriotism. No one questions whether I know anything about auto mechanics or chemistry when I comment about things like seatbelts or how to store cleaning supplies properly. But when me or other doctors, when we mention the need to evaluate the impact of guns on public health, we get all kinds of anger and haterade, and, we're unpatriotic and we're threats to everything America stands for, and what are we going to do to the Constitution? And, it doesn't have to be like that. And so, to be very clear, I am not against legal gun ownership. I'm not against legal gun ownership in the same way that I'm not against, people owning cleaning supplies, and I'm not against people having swimming pools. The American Academy of Pediatrics and lots of other medical organizations and public health groups, they do advocate the position that a home without a gun is a much, much safer home, and that our, families and children would be much safer if there were no guns in the home. And I respect that ideal. I agree with that ideal. But that is not the real of where America is when it comes to guns. The fact is that Americans own 310 million firearms, and that makes out to about 90 guns for every 100 of us. So my goal is to encourage dialogues and policies that, face this reality, but at the same time help all of us be safe when it comes to guns. Legal gun ownership is not a problem. When the lobbyists from the gun industry keep trying to, shut down public health research, or when they get in the way of doctors having conversations with patients, that's a problem. But, legal gun ownership in and of itself is not a problem. And, on today's show, we're going to explore all the different ways that public health can make legal gun ownership as safe as possible for all of us. Why do we want this public health approach? I'm going to rewind back a little bit to my own past, to back when I was a medical student. And I was a med student doing my surgery rotation. And I took care of a young family that survived a car accident. There was a young couple and their infant, and baby boy must have been somewhere around 10 months old. The parents were in the front seat, and both of them had worn their seatbelts, and their son was in an infant car seat in the back seat facing the rear window, correctly installed, and all of that. The car was totaled, and both parents were pretty badly injured. I mean, they had broken bones. Had some pretty bad cuts, but they were alive and they were able to communicate, and all of that. But the baby, if you looked at this baby was just having another regular Tuesday. I mean, this child was totally fine, laughing, playing, and I remember that the only reason our surgical team admitted the baby to the pediatrics ward was for observation, and it was really because we wanted to help, because both parents were so badly injured. They were in the operating room, and we needed time to contact, the extended family to come and help us out with the baby and pick him up. But the baby was totally fine. And the reason why I tell the story is because, I remember being amazed by the technology of car seats. I found it fascinating, and that, and the surgery residents at the time, they were telling me that because they were specializing in trauma, they were telling me that this happened all the time, and it continues to happen, where children do really well when they're in a car seat, in some pretty bad accidents, and it's because, and I just find that phenomenon interesting, because when you look at all of that, when you look at car seats, seat belts, speed limits, airbags. It's not like any of this stuff were lucky inventions. I mean, they're very intentional, developments in engineering, in our technology, and in our policies. Our society, our public sector, they took the time to develop policies that included things like speed limits, laws against drunk driving, requirements to wear seatbelts. And, they then did the next step of researching. Okay, does it make a difference when the speed limit is 50 miles an hour versus 70 miles an hour? We looked at how teenagers learn through driver's ed, and we put it together that teenagers need time, both with the book and with, an actual driving instructor behind the wheel. And even then, they needed, time to graduate into being an independent solo driver. And all of that progress, all of those policy implementations, all of that work, happened gradually, and it happened because there was a commitment to public health and safety that was independent of the automobile industry. Originally, the automobile industry was not crazy about having to install seatbelts into every one of their cars. There was a lot of pushback when some of these things were first developed. But even the car industry came around. They kind of started to realize that there was marketability in safety, and the engineers kept revisiting how to design a better car, how to make it safer. And when I think about the car that my family had when I was growing up, and I was really little, we didn't have airbags in that car. And now you'd have a hard time finding a new car that doesn't have airbags. And, everything from like the way a windshield is designed to the way that the frame of the car is designed, all of this is a big part of our car culture, but it's also a big part of our safety. And in the course of all that, public health has played a pretty valuable role because of the way that we collect data and the way that we communicate this data to all the different people involved, whether that's drivers, car manufacturers, legislatures, the highway patrol. There's a lot that public health is involved with in a lot of different sectors, so that the American driver and their family can be as safe as possible on the road. And the numbers prove the point, because since the 1960s, there's been this nice steady decline in the rate at which Americans die in car accidents. And And I just want to point out also that none of this threatens the American spirit of freedom when it comes to owning a car and using it and driving it. We all take pride in the, different kind of cars that are out there and the kind of cars that we own. And, the free market is also not hurting. There's never been any threat to capitalism in the auto industry because of the public health research that goes into keeping motorists safer. Um, and, and so when you look at that experience, what I find particularly tragic is that we don't seem to know how to use that same kind of know-how, that same kind of ingenuity, that same kind of commitment to safety and apply it to guns because we have these really unfortunate political sensitivities about firearms in this country when in fact we have all the know-how and we have all the skill, but we can't seem to muster up the political will to apply it to gun violence. To prove my point, back in 1993, Dr. Arthur Kellerman and his colleagues wrote a really important report in the New England Journal of Medicine, and the data in that report showed that rather than offer protection, there was a lot of times that when a gun was kept in the home, it was associated with an increased risk of homicide by a family member or an intimate acquaintance. Now, the point of this kind of research is, to provide the data to people so they can make well-informed, evidence-based decisions about whether to keep a weapon at home. It's the same kind of research that goes into advising people about, owning a motorcycle with a helmet versus owning a motorcycle and operating it without a helmet. It's to really help people make more informed decisions, and Dr. Kellerman and his colleagues said exactly that. But unfortunately, back in the 90s, the NRA lobbyists took all of that science as a big threat, and they were successful, unfortunately, in getting Congress to take away the CDC's funding to gather data about gun injuries. And it made it harder for doctors like Art Kellerman to write about these kinds of issues because, they felt that the CDC is not supposed to be taking a political position on gun control, despite the fact that it's just sharing science. It's not a political position to share what, public health research produces in terms of the results. And the sad thing is that, no other industry gets away with this. The CDC and other medical institutions and public health research centers, they do all kinds of work on how different foods impact different health outcomes. And, some of what they have to say, it's bad news for Coke and Pepsi and Frito-Lay, but none of them get to tell Congress to cut off funding for diabetes research or for heart disease research or for telling the CDC how to help Americans combat obesity. We don't see any of that kind of censorship from industry towards public health. And and when you look at what we were talking about earlier with cars, it's not like Ford or Chrysler or Toyota tells Congress to stop the CDC from researching and studying speed limits or traffic accidents. But that is exactly what the NRA lobbyists and other gun industry lobbyists have done time and time again. After the shooting in Newtown in 2012, President Obama issued a memorandum directing the CDC and other scientific agencies to go ahead and proceed with researching the causes of gun violence and to find ways of preventing it. And that's great. The memo made a very good legal argument saying that this kind of research is it's not prohibited by any language in any of the appropriations bills. But at the same time, when there's an absence of funding, it continues to make that kind of research of, gun safety and gun violence and injuries and things like that. It makes that research impossible when you don't have the funding to back it up. And so, to kind of shine some more light on this, a lot of different organizations and medical groups and public health groups tried to tried to find ways of getting the information that they did have and getting it out there, because they realized that Washington and a lot of the federal agencies were their hands were tied, and so it kind of fell upon the private sector world of research and a lot of advocates to bring the data to light. And so shortly after Newtown, the National Physicians Alliance, to whom I belong, partnered with the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence, or an advocacy group, to produce an excellent report. It's called Gun Safety and Public Health Policy Recommendations for a More Secure America. We're going to have a link posted on the website so you guys can dig into this in more details. But basically, the report has lots of common sense recommendations for public health policies at the state and federal levels. And it's worth going over some highlights, because it's interesting how there's a lot of consensus among gun owners and non-gun owners about about where gun policy should be, and then when you look at the actual laws, you kind of see this disconnect between what the people want and what the laws are actually saying and allowing. Example of that. Most of us are, pretty much on board with the idea of keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people who've had a pretty high-risk criminal background. But shockingly, only 23 states in the country prohibit gun ownership for people with violent misdemeanors or misdemeanors involving guns. And and it's really sad. 23 states say and stop people with violent misdemeanors in their background from owning guns. Now, that's not to say that, state laws are enough to really, stop high-risk people from buying the guns that they really want, because there's, lots of private sellers out there who can sell weapons without any kind of background checks of any kind. But it does help when, that's why we need, universal background checks, is to kind of help, states that are trying to do the right thing not be affected by, lax policies in other states, and then also not to be affected by private sales that are going on outside of the law or outside of the jurisdictions of the laws that are in place. So right now where we're at is that there are 17 states that have enacted laws that require a background check before at least some private firearm sales. And in 2013, 5 states adopted universal background checks, and those were Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, and New York. And that's some progress, but I know that in Colorado, a lot of the political leaders in their state legislature paid a pretty heavy price for backing that kind of policy. But nonetheless, that is representative of where the American people are. Like, they really do want the kind of common sense gun safety laws that stop people with dangerous backgrounds from getting their hands on guns. And universal background checks are a big part of that. Another area where there's a lot of consensus is when it comes to guns, is to stop people with a history of domestic abuse from having access to weapons. And when you look at the statistics, women in America are murdered by intimate partners or former partners approximately 9 times more often than they are murdered by strangers. And when that abusive partner has access to a firearm, the risk of homicide increases anywhere from 5 times to 8 times, depending on the reports that you read, especially for women in physically abusive relationships. And incidents that involve firearms are 12 times more likely to result in a death compared to abusive incidents that don't involve guns. And so, I think the average American is pretty smart when they recognize that, we need to do more to keep domestic abusers from having access to guns. And Congress reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act last year to include a provision that keeps most people from buying or possessing firearms while they are subject to full protective orders filed by intimate partners. Now, those are only applying to full protective orders because, get this, because of the gun lobbyists, the Violence Against Women Act does not require guns to be taken away or confiscated from people with temporary orders until they've had a chance to argue everything out in court. So you could have a domestic abuser with a temporary order, and they would still have access to their guns unless your state has, said otherwise. And this is where state legislatures are actually immensely important at protecting our families. And all of this, I hope, is clarifying why, physicians care about a lot of this. Because when you look at, how much, our states vary, how much our federal government is dragging their feet on this, as physicians and public health experts, we want to help our families stay safe. We are recognizing the reality of legal gun ownership. And we don't really want to wait too much for laws to come into place to, keep people safe when we can help our families stay safe just through simple conversations. But unfortunately, even that is being intruded upon in some states, and we're going to talk more about that. And a whole lot of the other topics that I covered with universal background checks and what's going on in state legislatures. Because when we come back, we're going to have a really good chat with our guest, Cliff Schechter. And so you don't want to miss that. And thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. You're listening to Dr. America, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
All right, welcome back. You're listening to the Dr. America Show. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram, and for this next part of our program, our episode about gun violence, we have Cliff Schechter here with us. He is the founder and president of Libertas, which handles media relations for political, corporate, and nonprofit clients. One of those clients is Mayors Against Illegal Guns, chaired by New York City Mayor former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. He is also a regular contributor to The Majority Report with Sam Seder, broadcast here on the We Act Radio Network. Cliff, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Sanjeev. I appreciate it.
So, Cliff, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to state laws and gun violence and public health. I want to start with one of the most frustrating pieces of legislation that I think I've ever seen, and that's the physician gag law in Florida. I mean, so, I don't know how much our listeners know, but, when physicians talk about with their patients about how to store guns safely, I think it's actually interesting to know that 64% of people who have gotten practical advice from their doctor go home and they actually follow the advice. It's actually a pretty good sign of progress. But despite all that, the good people of Florida in 2011, the state legislature had some other ideas about that. Do you mind kind of walking us through the gag law and where things are at now?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I think it's also worth putting in broader context that this gag law is part of what has been a long-term effort by the NRA both in our personal lives when it's your meeting with your doctors or in government to suppress information. And in essence, information is their enemy, because any objective look at what is a public health crisis today, you would find, as we found with smoking in the past, and as we found with drunk driving, the data is pretty easy to read, and it would tell you things like having a gun in your home makes you 4 times more likely to be shot with it than somebody else, which was a study done on the University of Pennsylvania School of Epidemiology, for example. So the doctor, the gag law is the same thing. It's that the NRA has fought to stop the CDC from getting funding, the Centers for Disease Control, I should say, to be able to look into, how these shootings happen, family shootings, suicides, and to do research. That's something that President Obama started to turn around with an executive order after Newtown. That's another way. They have these T-Hart amendments in bills where they won't allow different agencies of the government to share data and make it public. So this is part of that. Now, in this case, and I'll say it's kind of ironic considering these are the people that are screaming and yelling about their love for the Second Amendment. I guess the First Amendment, not so much, right? What it is that essentially, that, as you started to say, that it's very important that when you see your doctor, your personal physician, they ask you questions. Do you drink? Do you smoke? A variety of things, because they're trying to give you advice about yourself. And if you have children in your home, what is safest for everyone? And one of those would be, do you have firearms in the home, and do you store them safely? And they want that suppressed. They don't want that question asked, because, again, any sort of free-flowing information as far as the NRA is concerned about guns, where people can find out how dangerous they are, is a bad thing. So first we had that law was passed. Then, and I'll apologize, you probably know the name of the actual district court, but first a court overturned that law and said it was unconstitutional. But sadly, on appeal, the appeals court has now reinstated it while it is again being appealed, and they're going to look at this case yet again to see if this is in fact a constitutional acceptable practice for them to essentially tell doctors you're not allowed to talk about certain things with people,
right,
with your patients.
And and I think that's actually kind of the thing that's striking about this. Like, the plaintiffs in this situation are the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Florida chapter of the AAP. The American Academy of Family Physicians, and a whole lot of healthcare providers. Like, these are, they're the ones going to court. I mean, and so they're not, doing this because they have nothing better to do all day. I mean, they have patients to see, but, they're recognizing that their First Amendment right to, to free speech and to, counseling their patients under that right is being threatened here by people who are misreading the Second Amendment. Which, I mean, and I think the other part of this that I find kind of frustrating is that it's finding its way into other states.
Yeah, there have been a number of others. I think Missouri's one that, and I'm trying to think. I don't know if there are others where it's actively been debated yet. But this is not something that just suddenly turned up in Florida. I mean, Florida has been ground zero for most of the worst gun laws in the country, even worse than Texas, which would shock people, and Utah and whatever, because former head of the NRA and one of the NRA's top lobbyists, Marion Hammer, is based there. She's somebody that was given an award by Jeb Bush, I believe it was, for being a wonderful citizen. I think she's actually in the Florida Hall of Fame, which should make you a little bit sick if you live down there. And that's why Florida was the original stand your ground state. It was first passed there by Jeb Bush, which, if he runs for president, he can explain to all of us how that was helpful to anybody. But it expands almost like a virus, I would say, because what you've got is you've got the corporate bought institution that many people are now familiar with, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Committee, which essentially has these events each year where they invite corporate contributors and they invite state legislators who become members, and the state legislators basically pay almost nothing to show up, but the corporate guys pay a whole lot of money, these nice retreats and hotel, and these resorts and hotels and whatever, and shockingly, when a lot of these legislators come back from these events, they do exactly what whichever corporate lobby they meet with happens to tell them to do. So, I mean, a lot of it, obviously, the gun companies are well represented there, and the NRA, who gives a lot of money to ALEC. But, I mean, obviously, there's other terrible, there's the charter school industry, there's the pharmaceutical companies. I mean, there's others. It's not like this is unique to guns.
Sure.
But there's a reason why in some version of stand your ground or castle laws, which are essentially stand your ground for your home, which exists in the state I'm sitting in right now of Ohio, where they're now trying to expand it to stand your ground. That there's a reason why these laws have not just stayed in Florida, and so that's why the gag rule, if they're trying to pass with these doctors, you can expect it to go to other states. I mean, that's why you really do need the courts to strike this down. There's very few states. There are a few of them that can overturn an act of their state legislature and governor by referendum. But the others, until we get rid of some of these crazy right-wing legislators and governors who control a lot of really pretty moderate swing states at this point because of what we could call an apocalypse in 2010, and didn't get much better recently in 2014. So Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Arizona, and you can go on and on. There are a lot of states that aren't what you would consider to be states that are sort of more like Texas and Utah. Again, to mention two that are very conservative, but yet there's complete right-wing control. Or at least in Pennsylvania, the Democratic governor or the Republican governor lost recently, so maybe that'll change a little bit there. But other states are still fully controlled.
Right.
And you can expect to see these laws pop up in other states.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess like not all the news is necessarily bad news. The recent election cycle had some good news too, especially because it was powered by the people. I'm looking at Washington State with their ballot initiative. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but if you are, do you mind walking us through like how the good people of Washington State made their community safer for gun ownerships?
No, I know. I'm happy to talk about that, and I'll say that is part of it. If we have the time, of a lot of good news. I mean, it's easy to dwell on the bad news, and it's also easy to sort of say, some of our laws are so crazy right now, as you're talking about gag rules and stand your ground and things that are so ridiculous. But those started long before the tragedy of Newtown. And since then, you've had groups like Moms Demand Action, which started with, a woman, Shannon Watts, who was horrified by it, going to her Facebook page and starting it. I mean, these were really grassroots groups that started, and a lot of local groups, like there's one in Washington, Washingtonians, I guess, against gun violence. I can't think of what the exact name, but you get the point picture.
Right.
And so they had an initiative, 594, which they put on the ballot. And they said, first they went to the state legislature, and what has happened in a lot of state legislatures where these things almost pass, but the NRA has enough power where they can buy off enough legislators to make these things barely, fail. It happened in Minnesota too. It happened in Maine and a number of other states that took these up and looked at passing, stronger background checks. So in Washington, the way they handled it was, well, we tried the state legislature. We had a Democratic governor who would have signed it. We have a legislature. It almost passed, but was blocked, by the Republicans and who control the state Senate. And so they ended up saying, well, we're going to put it on the ballot, put it in front of the people, which I think is fantastic news also, because a lot of people would look at where we are right now and say, we're living through our second Gilded Age. And during our first one, progressives really took advantage of these methods of direct democracy to overcome a very similar phenomenon when railroad interests and banking interests and timber interests were buying up state legislators. And so this is not different from that. And they got this measure for one of the most stringent background check laws, probably just about the most stringent in the country, which I think is a great lesson for the NRA too. They blocked something that wouldn't have been as stringent, and then so they took it directly to the people. And it's not to say there wasn't some money put into it. Mayor Bloomberg's group, who you mentioned before, I don't work for them currently, but I did do PR for them for a number of years. They put some money into it. A very progressive billionaire who lives in Washington State, Nick Hanauer, who's sort of been one of the few who stood up on income inequality and other issues and kind of turned some heads talking about these things as somebody who's done so well and still willing to discuss them. He also, on gun violence, felt strongly and put some serious money behind gathering petitions or gathering signatures for petitions. And so they got it done. They got out on the ballot. They weren't outspent by the NRA, which is another way the NRA does it. They had enough money. The NRA was scared to come in because they knew they can't bribe people. They
Right.
can bribe
Right.
legislators. And I'm sorry, when I use bribe, I'm not saying, in the sense that these guys will go to jail, but in our current sense of our campaign finance system, where we
Right.
basically legalized bribery.
Right. Right.
And so, and that's what happened. But as importantly, Sanjeev, they've now in Nevada, they just turned in signatures, and frankly, it was the most signatures ever turned in for a ballot measure, and it's been approved. And now, definitively, there will be a ballot measure just like that one in Nevada, another state where the state legislature actually passed it there, and the Republican governor vetoed it, and they couldn't override his veto. So they'll have it in 2016, and a number of other states, such as Oregon, Maine, and others, are talking about the same thing. 24 states have initiatives. So,
And what I find so promising about a lot of that is that we're talking about states where if we were to just listen to the stereotypes broadcast by a lot of mainstream media and by like a lot even our own politicians, where we're told that west of the Mississippi and in western states and mountain states people love their guns and you can't get any of this done and blah blah blah. I find it actually pretty heartening that people are breaking past those stereotypes to say that there is a way to be safer, more responsible about gun ownership in this country. But it starts with we the people and not we the politicians.
right.
And and those are some pretty important glimmers of hope, especially as we're looking at the 2-year anniversary of Newtown.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, because what we've done is, imagine if we let the most extreme voices on any other issue, I guess it's gotten worse with women's rights lately because some of those voices have gotten more power. But if only the most virulent anti-abortion, anti-birth control, sort of legislators and others were the ones who had made all of our laws. That's what we had until recently with guns. It was the extremist sort of 5 to 10% who think a black helicopter is coming up to their house any moment to take their, big screen TV or something, and they need to be prepared with a literal, a room or a bunker filled with guns. You've got those types, and then you've got the people who are at the NRA and at gun companies who make a lot of money off of using those extremists and scaring those extremists to make a lot of noise that's a lot larger than their numbers, so these things don't get passed. And of course, sending lots of money to legislators. But, when people say this stuff about the West, it's interesting that that's the region because, again, we just talked about it. The state legislature in Nevada passed this, and now it's going to go on the ballot, and huge majorities support background checks there like everywhere else. We just passed it in Washington. Oregon has them already, I believe, for handguns, but they're going to put a much more comprehensive one on the ballot is what they're talking about there. Arizona is another state they're talking about. So it's not the West of old where people are riding around, packing heat everywhere they go, and that this is the way of life. There still are some states that are very sort of much more frontierish, Idaho and Wyoming, where the state legislatures certainly wouldn't even come close to passing this stuff, and you'd have to see. But people have to remember that in every single state that was tested and where there was polling after Newtown, vast majorities, even in Arkansas, I remember, in Kentucky, in Utah, which I've mentioned, and others, you had somewhere around 80% plus. The worst state of all, I think, was in the high 70s in terms of support for background checks. It went all the way up to the low 90s in terms of support in certain states. So even in what you would consider traditionally very conservative pro-gun states, no, they may not be as in favor of an assault weapons ban there. They may not be as in favor, of licensing and registration and things that people are talking about. But when it comes to background checks, everybody seems to get it on that it's just common sense to, if you're going to ask these types of questions of people for everything else that you're going to let them do in life, that, giving them a gun is a pretty serious thing, and we should probably know who's getting them.
Right. Right. Well, Cliff, I want to thank you so much for opening these little points of light that are happening all across the country. I think that it's been a great inspiration in our just all around day-to-day American civics that average Americans know that their public health is in their hands, their family health is in their votes, and it's giving me a lot of hope for our country and for our public health. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your insights.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
All right, guys. So that was Cliff Schechter, giving us the rundown of what's been happening in state legislatures across the country. Thanks again to him for joining us on the program. And we're going to, when we come back, we're going to be talking about what we can do while we're waiting for our leaders in Washington and in our state legislatures to get the laws moving. We're going to talk about what we can do as family members, as doctors, as teachers, as members of our community, what we can do to help our children. When we come back, we're going to be talking with Jenny Lentz from the Brady Center and Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. Thank you so much. This is Dr. America, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
All right. Welcome back to Dr. America. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. And for this next part of the show, I want to talk about the impact of gun violence on child health and to once again keep the focus of gun violence in a public health framework and what we can be doing as Americans and as communities to protect our kids from guns. And in order to guide us through a lot of important statistics and policy updates, I'm really excited about our next guest. We have Jenny Lentz from the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence. And since 2005, Jenny has been working to keep families, schools, and communities safe from gun violence. At Brady, she oversees public health and safety campaigns, including the Asking Saves Kids campaign, Speak Up, and Suicide Proof Your Home. These proven programs provide simple, empowering solutions that shift dangerous attitudes and behaviors and save lives. Through partnerships with leading health, education, law enforcement, and media organizations, Jenny manages the national implementation of these campaigns as well as community-based programs. In addition to her experience managing nonprofit organizations, Jenny taught elementary school in the Bronx, New York, practiced family law in Chicago, Illinois, and she's got great educational credentials from Clark University, Lehman College, and the Cardozo School of Law. Jenny, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so one of the interesting reports that the Brady Center published this year back in October was a report called The Truth About Kids and Guns. How and why did the Brady campaign decide to put all this together?
Well, mortality and injury data from the Centers for Disease Control and studies by various academics and other government and law enforcement agencies that we relied on for the report are available to the public, but they're not produced for a general audience. So as a result, media coverage is the primary way most Americans are learning about the impact of gun violence. And, not surprisingly, the media tends to cover the extraordinary school shootings and mass killings and not the ordinary types of gun violence that takes the lives of 7 kids and teens every day. So if we want to reduce gun injury and death in this country, we need to better understand where and how these gun deaths occur. And that's what we tried to accomplish with this report. Specifically, we wanted to put a spotlight on an aspect of gun violence that we think is overlooked, which is the dangers of unsecured guns, and encourage conversations about solutions that might exist outside of Washington, D.C., solutions that can be embraced by both gun owners and non-gun owners, regardless of their political views.
That's great. So let's dive right into the report. I like you were saying, I really appreciate how the data and the statistics are presented because it's presented as the facts. It's not sensationalized, and I think that it really brings it to the home front where people can kind of realize that there is everyday gun ownership that can be made safer for all of us and especially for our kids. But one of the things that I found particularly striking was that, not a lot of people know how guns compare to other leading causes of death for American children. What does the Brady research present?
Right. So for this report, we looked at the most recent available data, which at the time was in 2011, where we lost over 2,700 children and teens to gunshot wounds, and another 16,700 suffered a non-fatal firearm injury. As I mentioned, that comes to 7 kids who are killed every day and another 53 that are shot. Surprises a lot of people. Only motor vehicle accidents kill more kids than guns. That means more kids die from guns than cancer, from infection, from heart disease, every other cause except motor vehicle accidents. And for Black youth, for African American children, guns are the number one cause of death in this country, twice as high as motor vehicle accidents.
Wow.
So when we looked at these, deaths in detail, we see a common denominator that we feel is a real opportunity to reverse this trend. And that's unsafe access in the home, as you mentioned. There's something that we can do and we can start doing right now because 60% of all those youth firearm deaths occur in the home. 85% of the youth gun deaths for children under 14.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess the other part of this is that, there are different risks for different chapters of childhood. And so, with when you talk about unsecured guns, you're talking about guns that are kept loaded and unlocked, or basically just unlocked, right? Or, did you mean something else by unsecured?
No, the American Academy of Pediatrics advises that a gun should be kept unloaded, locked in a gun safe, ideally with the ammunition stored separately. So there's several kind of points at which a gun is that's kind of the ideal, and then as we kind of reduce each one of those layers of security, we have more and more of a risk. Obviously, a home without a gun is the safest home for children.
Right. Right. And coming back to the different kind of chapters of childhood, it sounds like toddlers have like a different risk profile than teenagers, and I was wondering if you could kind of like help us parse that out a little bit so that we can get a better handle on that.
Sure. So when looking at the differences between age groups, younger children, those under 10, those deaths are more likely to be the result of an unintentional shooting or homicide. This is probably a good time to highlight one of the real limitations of the data that we're working with, which also might be sort of surprising to most people, which is that medical examiners across the country classify these gun incidents, and they don't use a uniform standard. So, for example, if a 12-year-old finds a gun in the home that thinks it's empty and shoots his 9-year-old brother, that's generally ruled as a homicide in many parts of the country. So we have to be careful when we kind of separate out unintentional suicide and homicide and know that those lines are pretty blurred, especially when we're talking about unintentionals. Nevertheless, 24% based on the data we do have, about 24% of all unintentional gun deaths occur among kids under 20. And 34% of gun deaths of kids under 5 were unintentional, compared to just 2% of adults 20 and older. So we know for the little ones, suicide's not an issue. As our children get older, older teens are definitely disproportionately affected by guns, and now we are dealing with the fact that suicide is the second leading cause of death for young people in this country. And guns are used in 40% of all those youth suicides. 82% of the time that gun comes from their own home or that of a relative. So, suicide, we've reduced gun deaths among children over the past 10 years, but suicide continues to kind of be an outlier here. When it comes to suicide, a gun is very lethal, right? So in 9 out of 10 times, it's going to kill you versus 5% of things like pills and cutting. So based on the work that Harvard has done, there's a new energy to focus on how someone attempts versus why. Right? So as a parent, we were told over the years, look for the signs, how to know if your kid is depressed. The reality is for many, many young people, parents have no idea that their child's depressed. They're not in care, they're not being seen by a therapist. And, many young people, suicides are very impulsive because we've all been teenagers and we've all done dumb things.
Right.
The problem is when if you use a gun, it's much more likely to result in a death. And so, when parents think about safety in the home, we get a little sloppier sometimes as our kids get older because we think they're more responsible, they can handle more temptation. Maybe we've taught them gun safety, and we tend to get a little lazier and think about storage in a different way than we do if we have a 3-year-old in the home. But the reality is the risk is actually higher for a teenager than it is for a toddler.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you, helping us through some of those national statistics. But what I found also interesting in the Brady report was that when you look at it according to the states that have higher rates of gun ownership, the numbers go way up for risks and for a lot of these tragedies. And I was wondering if you could highlight a couple of those, just because I think it's really helpful for people to understand. We're entering the holiday season and people are kind of visiting state to state. It's one thing. I think like this is a important conversation to have, for the national picture, but I think for state pictures, it's important to kind of help us focus in a little bit. So, do you mind walking us through that?
Sure. I think, again, when our common sense, based on what we see in the news, would tell us that, the most dangerous place on earth is Chicago. But in reality, more youth die from guns rate-wise in Wyoming. Pretty much any other state in the country. So Wyoming, Louisiana, Mississippi, these are states that have among the highest youth gun deaths. That's not necessarily homicide, right? That's primarily driven by suicide. So our analysis demonstrates that where there are more guns, there are more gun deaths. And so there's a neat little map in the report that kind of shows states with high gun ownership, and generally speaking, there's a pretty high correlation between high gun ownership and high gun death, which should allow us to kind of rethink guns in our society, because these are lethal guns that we're talking about here. These are guns that families bring into the home with the idea that they're going to protect our family. That's a good thing. That's a noble kind of thing. They think they're offering protection, but really these guns are the ones that result in the majority of gun death and injury to children, particularly, young children and the women in their homes. So a gun in the home increases the risk for suicide, homicide, and unintentional for basically every member of the household. And we need, this report kind of made me think we definitely need to do a better job communicating the risks of a gun in the home, just like we communicate the risks of other dangerous things to our children. Unfortunately, a recent Gallup poll tells us that we have a lot of work to do, because 63% of Americans believe that a gun in the home makes them safer, versus in 2000 when only 35% of people reported that a gun makes them safer. So, this is definitely an area that we could improve how we communicate the risks. Definitely, for many people, they think about guns only in a political context. And overwhelming majority of people never think about guns at all if you're not engaged in political advocacy. So, we wanted to show this data, say, look, as objectively as we could, this data is very clear. This isn't about politics. A firearm in the home puts children and other members of the family at risk, and we need to have a conversation about what risks we're willing to take and how to mitigate them.
Right. You were describing how the American people have a noble intention of bringing a gun into the home, and then you were saying that 63% believe that a gun offers greater protection. I was curious about another statistic that the report describes, where I guess parents have a misunderstanding about their child's access to the gun, and that when the children were asked, we actually found the opposite. If Do you mind kind of walking us through the details of that picture?
Sure. So nationally, we know about 1.7 million children live with unlocked or loaded guns in this country. So that's a lot. So kind of why is that? And we feel that parents are generally making two dangerous assumptions. One is that their child doesn't know where the gun is located, right? So they've adequately hidden the gun, or if they find the gun, that they would know not to touch it. So the study that you referenced that we talked about in the paper looked at this conflict really between what parents believe their children do and what children actually do. According to this study, 76% of the children knew where the firearm was stored. 1 out of 3 of those kids indicated that they'd handled the gun, even though 22% of parents indicated that their child had never handled a gun, were contradicted. So, if everyone remembers being a child and finding something in your house and touching something that your parents told you not to, and we just can't think of a gun as any different.
Right.
There's lots of programs that have been promoted over the years, gun safety type education programs, which would potentially give parents a false sense of security that if their child's been told not to touch the gun by either the parent or a police officer or a teacher, that they won't. But kids don't listen to us.
Right.
That's part of what makes them children. And this risk is just too big of a one to take. And there's just, unfortunately, very, very little information about us being able to teach the impulsivity or the curiosity out of kids.
Right.
At work.
And I think, and that actually brings me to one of the things that I really love about the partnership between the Brady Center and the American Academy of Pediatrics, and that is the commitment to campaigns for safety that don't depend and wait for Washington or state legislatures to help our communities. And one of those campaigns that I'm familiar with and that I'd like to introduce our audience to is the Ask campaign. So do you mind just sort of introducing it and how maybe it could be used this holiday season as our families are traveling around the country?
Yeah. So the Ask campaign is for Asking Safe Kids, and as you mentioned, it was collaboration with the American Academy of Pediatrics. And it's based on a very simple fact that as parents, we do everything we can to keep our kids safe from harm. We use car seats, we put gates around our pools, we keep medicine and dangerous cleaning supplies out of reach from kids. And Ask hopes to inspire parents to think about guns the same way, to raise concerns and awareness about dangers of unsafe access to firearms, and ensure that children can't come across a gun in another home. So it's very simple, deceptively so. We're just encouraging parents to ask if there are guns in the homes where their children play. Just as it has become common for parents to talk about, allergies that their child has or who's supervising them when they're online, parents can take an important step to ensure the safety of their home by asking if there's an unlocked gun in the home where their children play. If the answer is no, great, one less thing you have to worry about. If the answer is yes, to make sure that guns are stored, unloaded, and locked, ideally in a gun safe with the ammunition stored separately. And definitely as the holidays approach, many children are playing in oftentimes relatives that don't have young children, so might not have thought about the safety of their home in that way.
Right.
Different parts of the country, as you mentioned, where gun ownership is very high or maybe more common than in the East, for example. So we're encouraging parents to have this conversation. It's entirely up to them how this conversation goes. We give advice and tips, but we're certainly not dictating. It's whatever makes you comfortable as the parent, however you need to talk about it. And we found that most parents who don't have this conversation, it just never occurs to them. For some non-gun owners, they might feel uncomfortable having the conversation, and we just encourage them to do it in a non-confrontational way. Hopefully feel some comfort in the fact that, 93% of parents we've surveyed, which includes gun owners, would not be offended by the question being asked if done in the right way. They understand that we're just concerned about our child's safety. And certainly there's a lot of discussion about this issue. It's become easier and easier to bring it up. It's on the news every day. So we're encouraging parents to take responsibility, just as they do every day, for their child's safety and ask the question.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for all this wonderful information, and we're going to have a link posted for the Brady report so our audience can learn more. And thank you very much for also taking us through the Ask campaign. Remember, guys, we just want you guys to be safe out there as you enjoy your holidays. So please, please, please ask your friends, ask your family members whether they have a gun in the home and how they're storing it, so that our children can be safe and can enjoy the holidays with us. Jenny, thank you so much for joining us today, and happy holidays to you.
Thank you. You too.
All right. So when we come back, I'm going to have a couple of closing remarks for you guys. Thank you very much. This is Dr. America, and we will be back in a few minutes.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Welcome back to Dr. America. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. We've had a really good, productive show today talking about gun violence as a public health issue. I want to thank my guests again, Cliff Schechter and Jenny Lintz, their insights and their sharing of their knowledge and wisdom, and what, just even practical steps about what we can do at the ballot box, at the doctor's office, and even with our own families as we travel around this holiday season to keep us safer from guns. Thank you to both of them for everything that they had to offer us in this conversation. I'm hoping that you guys have had a lot of information to go off of, so that when it comes to dealing with gun ownership in this country, we can make it safe, we can make it responsible, and we can have healthier lives for our families and for our kids. So thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And keep posting those pictures, guys, of the flu shot challenge. I haven't forgotten about that. Hit me with your best flu shot. Remember to post your pics on the Dr. America Facebook page. And we will be back next week. To your health. Salud.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.